Welcome to this event. This is a event hosted by Jacobin Magazine and Catalyst Journal. My name is Vivek Chibber. I'm the editor of Catalyst, copies of which are available for purchase, and our publisher, Bhaskar Sunkara, says there's also, you can subscribe to Catalyst at reduced rates if you should so desire, if you just walk up there after the event. This event is it's extremely interesting, even though it's of historical focus. It very much brings up issues that are still alive today, which has to do with the persistence of race as a central issue in American politics, looking back now 150 years ago, when the most concentrated expression of racial oppression in American history, which was slavery, finally came to an end. It's been a live issue in American historiography as to what the forces were that propelled the abolition of slavery, from the great man arguments about Lincoln to W.E.B. Du Bois's very important argument about what he called the general strike, which is the slaves themselves creating the collapse of the plantation economy by absconding during the Civil War, now to the revival of an argument that's not entirely new, but was not the most prominent in the past 20 years, which is that there was a gathering momentum towards abolition in not just the abolitionist movement, but also the Republican Party, which by the 1860 elections, Matt Karp says, and Eric Foner said this decades ago, had become a party quite committed to the abolition of slavery. What we're examining today is an article that Matt Karp, sitting next to me, published in the most recent Catalyst, called The Mass Politics of Slavery Abolition, in which Matt makes a quite arresting and I think significant argument on not just the political background to the abolition of slavery, but how the Republican Party tried to generate a mass movement towards its abolition. Now, that's in some ways a novel thesis, in some ways it's bringing up themes that are by now somewhat well known, and who better to engage it than the most well-known historian of mid-century, 19th century, mid-century politics. There's Eric Foner. Eric is the DeWitt Clinton Professor of History at Columbia Emeritus. He's recently retired, but of course that means that his extraordinarily prolific output will probably now accelerate, if anything. He is the author of many, many, many books, the most well-known of which, of course, is the classic book, Reconstruction, America's Unfinished Revolution, which came out, I think, in 1988, which has gone through a recent new edition in which Eric has written a sweeping new introduction. His most recent book is, again, very apropos of the topic today, it's called The Second Founding, How the Civil War and Reconstruction Remade the Constitution. This book has just come out, and it's hot off the press, and it would actually make a great Christmas present for those of you who are interested in this, who have relatives who actually read. And, of course, another book that I think is quite relevant, a fantastic biography called The Fiery Trial, Abraham Lincoln and American Slavery. This is just a smattering of Eric's prolific output. Our protagonist for this event, as it were, is Matt Karp. Matt is a potential victim, yes. Matt is a professor of history at Princeton University. He's the author of a book called The Vast Southern Empire, Slaveholders at the Helm of American Foreign Policy. This came out last year, and it has won many, many awards, extremely well known. Matt's one of the rising stars in the field. And I think this article and the conversation today is dipping into the new stream of research that he's engaged in, which has to do with the backdrop to abolition in the Civil War. What we're going to do is this. Matt will, since I assume naturally not everybody has read the article yet, Matt will give a presentation of about 12 to 15 minutes on what his argument is. Then Eric will start the conversation, and it'll be a back and forth between them. We will go on for about 45, 55 minutes or so with this conversation, and then around 8:30 we will open it up to audience questions and answers, and we'll have about half an hour of that. So with that, have I forgotten? Bhaskar, have I forgotten anything? Okay. Yes, right there. So without further ado, Matt will get us started, and then we will initiate the conversation.
It's bright, fluorescent Miami Hurricane Orange. You can't miss it, so please do buy. I want to thank everyone for coming out here tonight to talk about this. I want to thank Vivek for basically soliciting this piece, massaging it into life. Really, it's a testament, I think, to what you can achieve with a really strong-minded editor. It's not pleasant, but I think in the end, I think the piece reflects. It's not a pleasant process, you know. You don't want to know how the sausage gets made, but you know you like to eat the sausage. And I'd like to thank Bhaskar and Jason for organizing, Ella Mahoney, Jed Purdy, Corey Robin, other people who've read the piece also offered a lot of important feedback. And I'd like to thank Eric. This is not part of the introduction, but as he's known colloquially to some of the more uncouth members of the Jacobin editorial staff, the phone dog, for coming here to cross-examine me, potentially vivisect me today. But even if that happens, that will just be interesting. Okay, the article, to summarize, because you guys are all good comrades, you are all subscribers, sort of institutional subscribers to Jacobin and to Catalyst, I'm sure lifetime subscribers to Jacobin, and sustainers of Catalyst. But just in case you want a little refresher, I'll kind of go through this article. It's a bit long. Trespassed a little on your patience in writing this article. It's about 45 pages, but so it's a lot. It's a mouthful to sort of review before we go. But I want to kind of begin by giving a brief overview of the piece's goals, historically and to some sense politically, and then take you through some of the substantive arguments. And I'm sure a lot more will emerge in conversation with Eric. Okay, so first. The piece is about the political revolution that helped accomplish the destruction of slavery in the United States. That's a phrase that some of us are accustomed to hearing a lot these days, political revolution, in contemporary politics. But it's a phrase also that contemporaries in 1860 used repeatedly. I was literally just this morning reading a newspaper from Fort Wayne, Indiana, bragging about the political revolution, exact phrase that had brought the Republicans into power. The piece makes a number of arguments about, in a sense, it's not about causality, but it's about the character of that transformation and that revolution in the 1850s. It begins by sort of noting and then sort of moving beyond, in some ways, the ongoing debates about the relationship between slavery and capitalism in the field and now in the press, to consider what I hope we will talk about. Maybe we'll get into slavery and capitalism stuff today, but to investigate what I think is a subject that has been treated with much less seriousness by historians and by certainly popular history in recent years. The relationship between not slavery and capitalism, but emancipation and democracy. Essentially making the argument that emancipation was only made possible, the emancipation that occurred during the Civil War, due to a mass democratic political movement that took power and triggered the war and the anti-slavery and the revolution that produced emancipation. I build off, Vivek quoted one of Du Bois's famous phrases about the Civil War, the general strike of enslaved people during the war. But I really, in some ways, the inspiration for this piece was, the original title was Rethinking the Abolition Democracy. That's another phrase of Du Bois's. He uses it to sort of describe, characterize the abolitionist vanguard, basically, in his view, that captained the Republican Party and sort of helped organize the movement against slavery before the Civil War. But that's a subject that he doesn't really treat in Black Reconstruction, how this minority maneuvered through the American electoral political system to take power in a majoritarian democracy. And I think that's a subject that, in some ways, a lot of, even after centuries of extremely powerful and perceptive writing about this subject, that historians still haven't reckoned with as fully as they might do. So in some ways, this argument that anti-slavery was a mass political movement that achieved fruition in electoral politics takes aim, I guess, to put the cards on the table with broadly two schools of, at least wants to sort of quarrel a little bit, or at least engage. I'll try to be gentle to get us started with two different kind of groups or alternate interpretations of this period. First, I think what you could call a broadly kind of an interpretation shared by, you could call, a broadly liberal group of historians, centered on what Edmund Morgan famously called the American paradox, the sort of interpenetration of slavery and freedom. He elaborated this in his great book on American slavery, American freedom, and especially American democracy and American slavery, the ways in which, focusing especially in the early 19th century on the ways in which the slave power benefited from its standing in a racialized white man's democracy, and used democratic power to sustain itself in some ways, and that's the way that we should understand slavery and democracy in some sense. I want to argue with that and sort of emphasize the ways in which actually democratic politics was the weakness, in fact, the Achilles heel of the slave power, not its actual strength. As Frederick Douglass said, we are the strong and they are the weak. We are the 14 millions in the North. Slaveholders number only about 300,000 in the South. In a majoritarian democracy, if the majority can be brought to bear against this oligarchic institution of slavery, democratic politics can work to our advantage, not to our deficit. Second, in some ways, this is less a central focus of the piece, but I think implicitly I'm taking, at least I'm pushing in a different direction from a more traditional Marxist interpretation of this period, which, in a sense, depicts anti-slavery or free labor ideology as the kind of political manifestation of deeper structural economic changes in northern society, in the northern economy. Again, much like the first interpretation, I'm not saying it's entirely wrong. This is clearly an important, we need a political economic accounting of all of these factors. And yet, the essence of the case here is that there was nothing about the Republican Party and its formation in the 1850s that was foreordained or mandated by the development of a new form of capitalism in the North. In fact, this was a movement and a political and a transformation that was achieved in some ways against the most powerful economic actors of the day. So, in that sense, as I said, the Achilles heel of the slave power was not its inability to adapt to capitalism. And in this sense, I'm in partial agreement with some of the historians who've emphasized the ways in which slavery proved very compatible with mid-19th century capitalism. It was not an inability to adapt to capitalism, but it's, in a sense, its weakness in a majoritarian democracy when a political movement could be built in opposition to the slave power. So those are the kind of big, broad strokes of things. Maybe, is that how long I've lost track of time there.
7, 8 minutes.
Okay, a few more minutes. Okay, so then that gives me some time to go through, is this all right, Eric? To go through a few of the sort of substantive arguments that the piece makes, just without being too detailed. But basically, there are sort of 5 large points that the article makes if you go through the sections. The first, the piece makes, and I don't know how much we want to talk about this, but but I think it's significant that I haven't really seen this argument engage, but it makes an argument about the radical distinctiveness of anti-slavery mass politics in the United States, in the sense that emancipation in the United States followed a chronological sequence that was distinctive in the long history of abolition and emancipation in the Atlantic world, from broadly the 1770s to the 1880s. Pretty much everywhere in the Atlantic world, when slavery ended, it ended in relationship to war, or in some cases, a kind of royal decree or a judicial verdict. Only in the United States, the piece sort of begins with this observation, only in the United States did a kind of anti-slavery mass politics use anti-slavery to capture the power of the central state, which then triggered the war. In generally, which emancipated the slaves. In general, the pattern goes the other way. In virtually every other case in the Americas, whether it's the American Revolution in the northern states, or whether it's in Latin America, or whether it's the French Revolution of 1848, or whether it's the Haitian Revolution, in general, a war, some kind of anti-colonial war often, broke out that then produced chaos and instability and provided an opportunity for anti-slavery to sort of, either for emancipation to happen on the ground in the case of Haiti, with Toussaint and the slave rebellion and the establishment of the Haitian state, or in other places for political figures, legislators, to sort of take advantage of this war-born revolution to emancipate slaves. The American case was very different. It was specifically anti-slavery politics through the mechanism of, through the sort of vessel of electoral competition in the United States that produced the anti-slavery Republican Party that then triggered the war. So I think that's a significant sequential difference that matters because it underscores the sort of distinctive scale in some ways of American anti-slavery. And that moves to the sort of second main argument of the piece, that anti-slavery politics was mass politics. This was not the politics of a tiny virtuous vanguard. In some ways you could argue it began that way, and we can talk about the relationship between abolition in the 1830s and anti-slavery in the 1850s. But when it achieved the political revolution of 1860, it did so through mass politics. In fact, the invasion, you could call it, of anti-slavery into the regularly scheduled calendar of American elections, into the kind of, the sort of limited but real mass democracy, the broadly adult male, mostly adult white male democracy of Jacksonian America, did not diminish the power of anti-slavery politics, but in fact intensified it, made it more militant, made it more capable of taking on the slave power, and that it was this mass political movement, not a tiny minority of abolitionists that sort of deserves to be at the center of the story of American anti-slavery. So a third major argument then, anti-slavery is mass politics, anti-slavery also as a kind of class politics. Jim Oakes, who's sitting here in the front row, has written a little bit about this. He's written a little bit about all of these things, just like Eric has. But anti-slavery is class politics in the sense, not in the sense that it's a working class politics, although appeals were made to the working class on those terms, but a class politics aimed at the oligarchic slaveholding class that ruled the United States before the Civil War. A class politics that was very specifically targeted at slaveholders as a class that differed from other forms of Jacksonian politics, especially Whig politics, which posited sort of class harmony and classless economic opportunity for all. The Republican Party made the critique of the slave power, the slave oligarchy. William Seward talked about not 1/100th part of the American population owned slaves, literally an antebellum 1%. The Republican Party made this kind of class politics central to anti-slavery politics. Okay, and then folding the last two sections in so we can get to the person who most of you came to see. I also make a series of arguments to sort of uphold the significance of anti-slavery mass politics and anti-slavery class politics. I talk about black abolitionists and enslaved people in the South themselves, and the ways in which black abolitionists, despite a much ambivalence, reading Frederick Douglass in the late 1850s is fascinating. It's the classic sort of dilemma of a radical amid a political revolution. Despite much ambivalence about the purposes and nature of the Republican Party, ultimately, I believe the majority and the significant majority of black political abolitionists and political actors came to see that anti-slavery mass politics was actually much more powerful than anti-slavery, than abolitionist moral politics or abolitionist consciousness-raising politics, separate from electoral struggle. And Douglass ultimately came to see the Republican Party as an instrument that could dethrone the slave power and ultimately destroy slavery itself. Before the Civil War, he came to see this. And I think he was hardly the only one. There's some really interesting work on this. And finally, there are fragmentary but suggestive and really significant evidence, in my view, that enslaved people in 1856 and then again in 1860 during the hue and cry of these incredibly intensely contested electoral campaigns in the North, that enslaved people knew the score and knew that there was a possibility of their situation changing based on the transformations in American electoral politics. There's rumors of insurrections in 1856 and 1860, and evidence in memoirs and narratives about the ways in which this electoral campaign itself, perhaps more even than more famous events like John Brown's Harper's Ferry raid, actually sort of, in a sense, put the enslaved in a position to sort of seize their own freedom even before the Civil War began, at least sort of primed that pump in a certain sense. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Those are the major arguments of the piece. I want to say the book because I am writing a book about this. But let's have a conversation and see how much of this holds up.
Well, thank you, Matt. Yeah, thanks to Matt, thanks to Jacobin and Catalyst for organizing this event. I'm delighted to see that a subject that was the subject of my dissertation in some ways 50 years ago still can draw a crowd. Now, I know it's to hear you, but it's great that there's life in this old subject yet. I think Matt gave a very good synopsis of his article. I urge people to read it. It's very provocative and interesting, and it has both historical and contemporary political implications. I'm going to leave the contemporary politics to the side for the moment. Maybe a little later we can get into that. But I think Matt makes a good, strong, powerful case, as you heard. It's not a full book. He's writing that. It's nobody. It would be pretty easy to pick a hole. Oh, he didn't talk about this, that. 40 pages may be long for an article, but it's not that long. So I'm going to start. Let us just jump in with the question of slavery and democracy, actually, which you emphasized is pretty important to your article. I agree with you entirely that that the democratic quality of American politics, which we all, associate with Jacksonian democracy, if you want to call it that, the sort of rise of a mass democratic politics, limited, obviously. It's for white men, basically, right? African Americans in the North had little political power. Women had no voice, at least officially, in political, in the political realm. But nonetheless, it's certainly a lot more widespread, involved a lot more, a higher percentage of the population than in other countries. Although I want to push you a little on the notion of a doctrine that I always try to fight against, though I sometimes succumb to it, of American exceptionalism, the bane of most historical writing in this country. Not yours exactly, but generally when people invoke American exceptionalism, I run for the hills. But in this case, you make a pretty strong case. But is it really true that mass mobilization against slavery only occurred in the United States? I mean, it seems to me that in Great Britain, not through voting, you make the point, of course, that a very pretty small population could vote there, but the mass petition campaigns against the slave trade and then against slavery in the 1820s and up to the 1830s, what were a form of political engagement, which did have a tremendous effect, even though they did not change, as you say, here the control of the central state changed. There, no, the class that controlled the central state remained in control, but still they were very pushed by mass mobilization on the ground level against the African slave trade and then against slavery itself. Without a war, there was no war going on in the British Empire at the time of the emancipation of the slaves. Now, it produced an emancipation that was quite different from the emancipation here. It was a kind of a half-baked emancipation in some ways. There was this attempt to have this period of apprenticeship, which immediately broke down, and mainly the difference is the slave owners got paid off a lot of money in the British Empire, which of course they didn't get a penny here for their slaves. But I want to just press you on the question of whether it's really accurate that mass anti-slavery politics only takes place in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I'm no want to get this. Yeah, I'm no partisan, or I'm not going to go to the mat for American exceptionalism. I mean, I guess the word that I tried to use was distinctiveness, because I mean, whatever, and maybe that's semantic.
I don't care what.
Maybe that's semantic. But I mean, but every country is distinctive, right? I mean, there are things that happen in France that didn't happen anywhere else. There are things that happen in Haiti that didn't happen anywhere else. There are things that happen in, Pakistan that haven't happened anywhere else. I think, and I guess what's significant to me, I mean, and you're right, the British case is, and Vivek pushed me on this, other people have pushed me on this too. Why do I insist at all on any kind of distinctiveness here when what seems broadly true is that in both of these countries, where Britain certainly had the second, along with the United States, the most sort of formally developed. Brazil also had a sort of late arriving and somewhat significant, but clearly Britain and the United States had the most formally developed peaceful anti-slavery movements that developed independently of a war and involved, huge sections of the economy, I think, of society. I think Seymour Drescher's estimated something like 1/5 of, British adult men signed a petition against slavery in the 1830s. There was clearly some kind of mass mobilization happening. Why do I insist on that being a distinction? I mean, in some cases, you could make the case for, and I think maybe Drescher has gotten close to doing this, for British exceptionalism, because they had the mass mobilization and they didn't have a civil war. They were the only country to sort of do this entirely peacefully in terms of a major slaveholding country. But I think what's significant here is not so much like who's special, who's the most special. We're all special. Everybody here is special, right? The United States is also special, but whatever. That's not important. What's important is how explosive this was. And how that the particular explosiveness of the combination of anti-slavery and mass politics, which sure it's distinctive, but it's explosive, and that accounts for a really significant difference in the American case and the British case. That in Britain, in some ways, the achievement of abolition defused a political issue, the sort of the anti-slavery political victory, in a sense, in the 1830s. In the United States, it was all managed within the kind of existing by the existing political order, and in some ways the existing political and social ruling class, the rising capitalist class and the landholding aristocracy. They all kind of took it on and achieved it. In the United States, the victory of anti-slavery came with the overthrow of a ruling class and precipitated the most violent and most revolutionary war of emancipation in the Atlantic world, barring the Haitian Revolution. So, and on a scale much larger than the Haitian Revolution. And I think that is worth underlining, and maybe this gets to the political question. I won't go deep into this, but I think it is worth underlining, maybe precisely for American-focused reasons, that the United States is a country that's experienced distinctively violent and radical revolutions. This is a country that is not contra other sort of exceptionalist narratives of the United States, right? This is a country that has not kind of been is notable for, a kind of steady incremental progress towards liberty and justice, but in fact has experienced, in this case, the victory of this political movement precipitating arguably the most violent and dramatic and revolutionary process, explosive process of its kind in the Atlantic world, which seems worth emphasizing to sort of underline that point about that this is part of the American experience.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but the question of, what are the implications of the limitations of American democracy itself for the development of your argument? And I'm not talking about the obvious fact that various groups were excluded from voting, which is true, but I think it's actually deeper than that. And you hint at it at one point when you mention that the sort of homestead demand, that the Republican Party not only talked about slavery, but they talked about free land in the West for settlers, and the sort of homestead principle, which was very popular with many people, is sort of predicated on the dispossession of Native Americans, right? I mean, there's not going to be land for homesteads unless natives are moved even further than they had been moved under the Jacksonian era. And in fact, if you go back to, James Madison at the Constitutional Convention said very explicitly, and I will get to the class issue in a bit, but he said the way to avoid class conflict in the U.S. is to extend the sphere, that is, move westward, so that people who fear will not be trapped in a working class situation forever. You can always reinvent yourself by moving west, expand the sphere. That was his thing. Well, that meant from the very beginning, dispossession of Native Americans was built into the system. The system could not survive without that. Land enables you to avoid class conflict, not embody it, said Madison. To have economic progress without class distinctions, as were happening in Great Britain. I'm not just saying, oh, well, look at how bad these people were, but isn't there something about that? Is there something fundamentally flawed in some way about American democracy in that it is predicated on a kind of constant warfare, really, against the native inhabitants of the continent? Or is that really not a sort of separate issue? I mean, I'm reminded of when Lincoln, in his annual message to Congress in December 1864, we had spent a lot of time talking about Native Americans. And in the same speech, he talks about how great it is that white settlers are moving west despite the war. There's all this new land is being opened. And then we have to deal, properly with the Indians. We have to give them justice. We can't be as, but those two things are incompatible. So what are the, if any, the implications of that for this story of the, rising democracy?
It's a major question that I have to wrestle with in this project, and I think maybe I think it's fair to say the most difficult question for me. I think in some ways for all historians of the Civil War. I mean, I noticed this especially at conferences or seminars when historians of indigenous Americans, Native Americans, present on the 19th century, and when historians of slavery and emancipation present on this period, we're just talking past each other.
Yeah.
And we both, I found this, it's true in both cases, but I found that, and there have been some attempts to sort of develop master syntheses that reconcile both of these processes as forms of, Nicholas Guyot has one effort, which I didn't think you weren't too persuaded by.
No, I wasn't, but it was a good try.
Yeah. About Colonization and the reservation system as kind of a parallel process. Steve Hahn has done a version of that in some ways in his last book, and is working towards. And I think these are brave and important efforts. But I also think, and there's no question, in terms of what I'm going to. How I think about this, especially on a question like the Homestead Act, there's no question that Republican ideology, American democratic ideology, American egalitarianism itself, I think, is premised in some essential way that I don't think it's premised on slavery or the denial of. I don't think Morgan's American paradox holds in all cases, or even in many cases in American history. But I do think that. Sort of settlerism is pretty endemic. It's pretty hard to dislodge from American politics in the 19th century.
That's exactly the question I was going to follow with. Is this therefore to be considered, as some people do, fundamentally a settler society and a Heron folk society, where the democratic process itself is premised on a kind of, to use a modern phrase, a kind of white nationalism. Which is still alive and well right now, as we all know. Again, the point is not to just point fingers or say, look how bad people were, but how this maybe sets limits to what can be accomplished with the revolutionary overthrow of slavery.
Certainly. I mean, there's no question, and I would, I think this is an issue for me because I'm invested in, and maybe we can talk later about why I do think there are usable pasts in here for even our contemporary political moment. But that certainly doesn't entail sort of pretending that there aren't deep flaws or embedded injustices in this history, even in the characters that I find most sort of significant or admirable. That's not really the premise here, is to find good guys or something like that. I think what's significant though is, and where I would push back a little bit is, I don't think that that the sort of the shared assumption that this continent belonged to basically Euro-American settlers. I don't think that when it came to the politics of slavery and emancipation, which were, in my view, still the preponderant story of this period, in the sense that they involved the overwhelming majority of people on the North American continent. In that sense, I don't think that fact meant that the Republicans were avatars of white nationalism in a certain sense. I guess I would disagree with that, because I think the thrust of Republican politics was, in some sense, to contest not to contest white supremacy entirely, but to contest this institution of slavery, which had been the kind of foundation, the sort of essential cornerstone of racial oppression, although the cause of it, of labor oppression in the United States, and in that sense, following that narrative, I don't think that narrative gets. I don't think that narrative gets thrown off track by the fact that there were other horrible things happening simultaneously, in effect.
Well, I will say that I think the emphasis on democracy, which you emphasized, is a very valuable one, and that people at the time understood the Southerners at the time understood the danger that democratic politics presented to slavery. John C. Calhoun was very explicit about this in the 1830s. Yeah. He saw the abolitionist movement, which was tiny at that moment, as a real threat to a lot of slave owners said, these guys are, a couple of crazy people up in Massachusetts, they're not going to bother us. But Calhoun said, no, in a democracy, even a flawed democracy, public sentiment is really what political power has to rest on. And if the abolitionists succeed in generating a public sentiment against slavery, that will reverberate back to us. And if you go 30 years later and you read the declarations of the secession conventions in the South, the South Carolina one is very explicit about talking about the real problem here is Northern public sentiment. Yes. It's not this action, it's not that they put a tariff on or that they won't return our fugitive slaves, although they're pretty annoyed about that. But no, it's public sentiment, and there's nothing we can do about that, really. Which is why, which is why it's worth pointing out that even though there was a political revolution, it was not that, it was not a total revolution. If the South had not seceded, the Democratic Party would have controlled this Congress after the election of 1860. Lincoln won the election for president, obviously in a weird kind of vote, 40% of the total national vote, but all the electoral votes of the North. That demonstrated that the North, if it were united, could control the presidency. But with a Democratic, it's not, you said, what the hell could Lincoln do with a Democratic Congress sitting there? But that's not what they're worried about. They're not worried about what Lincoln's going to do next year. They're worried about a kind of a shift of power within the nation, as you point out. That's very important. So, but I don't think we should say, hey, the Republicans just took power in 1860. They took power because the Southerners left. That really gave them full power, which they didn't actually have as a result of the election.
True. But I mean, I would put that more strongly than you. I mean, it's not just South Carolina, right? For instance, I mean, this is a pretty common theme through all the declarations. Right. I think Georgia says something most explicitly. Lincoln has captured the popular mind of the North. This idea that it's not actually the fact. I mean, it does, okay, without being, we're in this room, so I'm going to allow myself some looseness about the contemporary analogies. But it does remind me in some ways of debates about, well, what could Bernie Sanders do? If there's a political revolution, how much could he achieve given all of these institutional blockages?
Or Warren, the same thing.
Yeah, or
could she really get a wealth tax?
Well, yeah, right. I mean, what could any left figure do in to use it to go back to the 19th century terminology, which I love, in the presidential chair? Right. I think we should bring that one back, the presidential chair. Trump would probably like that. They always talked about, well, when we sit a Republican in the presidential chair. Well, it's not so much that there are immediate things that the executive branch could do, certainly, to curtail the rendition of fugitives, to insist on due process in the execution of the Fugitive Slave Clause, that would significantly harm or at least undermine slaveholding power, et cetera. There are a lot of things. But that's not the process. And Republicans themselves are very explicit about this, that this is not something that Southerners were kind of like, in my view, were not overreacting or jumping out of their seats at an effectively, something that all shrewd political observers of the day knew that President Lincoln couldn't do anything because we have all these institutional roadblocks. They knew that this was part of a political project where I think Henry Wilson lays it out at one point. He's like, well, we're going to get the presidency, we're going to get the Senate, we're going to get Congress, we're going to get the Senate, we're going to get the Supreme Court. We're going to build this movement in opposition to the slave power, which is a winning political movement that has generated record turnout. Turnout in New York State, I was reading about this in 1860. It was of eligible voters, granted, so that's white men. Still, 95%. I mean, unheard of rates of popular mobilization. Lincoln carried New York, by a considerable margin. Probably something like more than half the eligible men in New York voted for Lincoln, actually cast a ballot. This popular mobilization isn't going to necessarily stop just because we won this election. This is going to continue until we've stripped the slave power from government. We've stripped slavery of its most essential prop, the strength of the executive branch that is holding this institution up. We've quarantined it, and we're going to slowly pick it up, slowly but surely, and maybe not even that slowly, depending on who you ask. If you ask Owen Lovejoy, it might not take that long. We're going to pick this motherfucker apart. And that is more or less how they said it very openly in all sorts of speeches in the North. And so the idea that Southerners were kind of like overreacting and setting aside this kind of blundering, kind of sequence of dominoes by fleeing the Union, I think it's a much more rational act given the seriousness of this Republican political movement to commandeer the state for anti-slavery purposes.
This leads directly to my only criticism of the article, or one little criticism here, which you mentioned actually. I think when you talk about the sort of the slave insurrection panic of 1856, the fear, I am nervous about political analysis based on fear, which sort of puts it on a psychological level, that the problem was they kind of just were a little bit too freaked out, There were plenty of slave insurrection panics all throughout American history, and Southerners had gotten kind of used to them. But the larger point is, I'm not sure that, you talked about this a few minutes ago at the very end of your presentation, about a sort of, I don't know if you want to call it an alliance or something between the anti-slavery politics and the slaves' action themselves. That's borrowed from Du Bois, Black Reconstruction. Yeah. And yes, in the Civil War, I think that is a legitimate way to look at things, what he calls the alliance between the abolition democracy and slave activity, whether you want to call it a general strike or just, whatever you want to call it. But I think before the Civil War, that's, I would need to see a lot more evidence to say that was, yes, we know that slaves knew what was going on. They heard about it. Their owners were debating these things. They knew that, there was a party in the North that was criticizing slavery. That could not be kept secret in the South. But I don't know. The idea of an alliance suggests more than, I think, just that. So
incipient, inchoate.
Okay.
But look, I mean, I think one of the burdens of this article, and in a deeper sense of the book that I want to write, is about connecting. I think in the conventional portrait of the period, 1861, firing on Fort Sumter is a kind of chasm. Lincoln kind of gets elected, but as a sort of slavery restrictionist who's not really an abolitionist, and so then the South overreacts and secedes, and then the compromise somehow fails, and then hot-headed Southerners fire on Fort Sumter due to sort of the mechanics of relieving an obstreperous commander in in the hottest harbor in the Confederacy, and then suddenly the war breaks out, and the sort of the emancipation train even then is moving slowly, according to some accounts, although we've left that behind now, I think. But still, it's only after the war begins that anything like emancipation, anything like the abolition democracy, anything like a mass struggle against slavery itself, rather than the extension of slavery, can take place. And I think what I want to argue, and this maybe goes back to some of the points about the American versus the British experience, is that it's actually the experience of mass politics, particularly in these national election campaigns in 56 and in 60, both in the North and to some extent in the South, that actually prepares the way for that experience of emancipation, of the general strike, of the war against slavery in 1861. That this didn't come out of nowhere. This, in fact, reflected and drew on these the convulsions that had the explosiveness of emancipation drew on the explosiveness of anti-slavery politics before, and you can see that in the North with something like the Wide Awakes. This kind of paramilitary organization that's of 100,000 Northerners who are marching down.
Where the Wide Awakes originated with the first group of the were Know Nothing Party.
Right. Right. Well, that's true. And we can talk about how that plays into it too. Yeah, it's true, but it becomes by 1860 it's unambiguously a Republican and in fact an anti-slavery, anti-slave power kind of organization.
But that leads to
anti-democratic. But just quickly to get to the slave part. So that's in the North. I think if you want to understand why hundreds of thousands of Northerners jumped to enlist in the Army in 1861, I don't think you can just say, well, because they insult to the flag at Fort Sumter. Obviously, yes. But the insult to the flag at Fort Sumter came atop this decade, years and years of intense mobilization against the slave power that prepared that response because it was only the last in a long line of insults that the slave power had perpetuated. Right. And same thing in the South. And the evidence is sketchier here, but I think it is significant that that these insurrection rumors, for whatever they're worth, are clustered very significantly after these national campaigns. I don't think that that's a coincidence. And the intensity of them, hundreds of reports in which hundreds of slaves are ultimately arrested, and John Bell, senator from Tennessee, has several of his slaves are actually hung because of probably nothing nearly so extensive was in the works. We don't know, but clearly. There was an impact. I think there was at a minimum. I don't think we should fail to acknowledge that there was an impact.
Yeah, I would like to see more, and in your book, about who actually is. There's something a little abstract about the mass movement in this article, which is inevitable in a relatively short piece. But who is actually, who is the base, the voting base of the Republican Party? By class, by ethnicity, by region, whatever it is. There is a tendency, I've fallen into this myself, to find the most vivid quotations, but very often they are the radical Republicans. They're the Henry Wilson, Owen Lovejoy. But there's a lot of Republicans who are not radicals like them. What enables the party to succeed is somehow bringing together people who have been fighting against slavery for decades with people who were just kind of ordinary Whigs or Democrats a few years before, but suddenly have now found themselves for various reasons, sometimes anti-slavery, sometimes more economic reasons or whatever. So it would be, I'm not asking you to give us analysis now, and then of course, but it feeds into the class question that you raised. And I think there's how shall I put it, a little sleight of hand in introducing class politics when it's the united North against the slave power and not talking very much about class conflict within the North. Right. As you know, there were people in the labor movement of that time who said the anti-slavery movement is actually a plot by capitalists to divert attention from the exploitation of labor in the factories of the North. Some historians have taken that and gone way far with it to suggest that really anti-slavery is, well, you mentioned, is just a kind of the cover for capitalism. By identifying slavery as the one illegitimate labor system, you're implicitly normalizing the system in the North. But you do give a few quotes about people talking, I think in a kind of vague way, about, capital is on the side of slavery. Yeah, the lords of the loom, the cotton manufacturers, the New York City merchants, absolutely, you were right. Powerful economic groups in the North are tied into slavery. And yet there were plenty of others who weren't. And in fact, the whole economic, I think, trajectory of the 1850s is to make the North less dependent on slavery. Railroad and the opening up of the Northwest to commercial farming and factories out there. So, in other words, I think, one can maybe, I'm kind of rambling here, but one can go back to a book probably not cited nowadays very much in this context, Alan Dawley's book long ago about Lynn, Massachusetts, class conflict in that shoe manufacturing city. And he kind of ends, now this is maybe too, he says the Civil War is the end of class consciousness because the owner, the employer and the employee march off together, so to speak, to fight the slave power, that you had a big strike in Lynn in 1860, and yet the class consciousness that represents is overwhelmed by the Civil War, and the issue is the North, the united North versus slavery. So I'm not quite sure how class relations in the North fit into the picture, which I agree with entirely, that there's a rhetoric of the slaveocracy being a hostile, a power hostile to ordinary Northerners.
Yeah, I mean, that's complicated. I mean, I love Lincoln's sort of poetic line about of strange, hostile, and discordant elements. The Republican Party is
right,
this.
It is, but
it's like any party
politics
in the United States, any winning party in our in effect duopoly in our in our two-party state is bound to have discordant elements. And actually, Eric's book on this. Free labor, free soil, free men. It's still by far the best book on Republican ideology, and has by far the best. It's sort of driven in some ways the meat of it by this taxonomy of the kind of ideological flavorings and disagreements within the Republican Party. The radicals, the moderates, conservatives, former Democrats, nativists, etc. And these all those divisions we would be well. Certainly I will do well to attend to those when I'm writing this book. But I think, I guess I do see the Republican Party as heterogeneous but homogenous on the central issue of hostility to the slave power and insistence on its overthrow. And in that sense, it's not just the radicals. It's true that maybe they are the kind of most eloquent often,
most quotable.
Yeah, or the most, the leftists always got a peacock, But it's not just the radicals who are committed to a kind of a mortal combat in a sense with the slave power, insist on the need to overthrow this class. I mean, somebody like that's a staple of the rhetoric of someone like Henry Lane of Indiana, who's a moderate ex-Whig kind of type, or somebody like Lyman Trumbull, who is a Democrat, who is plenty racist in his way and a problematic figure, but deeply committed to the overthrow of the slave power in Illinois. I think I guess two things. So first, on the ideological content of the Republicans, and then on class in the North. I guess I would say in that unity against the slave power, the radicals in effect constituted a majority within a majority, that they in effect dictated the discourse of the 1850s, and starting with the appeal to independent Democrats after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Giddingses, the Chases, the Wilsons, the Sumners, reduced Northern politics to this binary of slavery and freedom, which is a deeply radicalizing binary that in effect puts not just the Constitution of Kansas, but the system of slavery itself as the sort of sum of all villainies, as they always call it, at the center of what this American political struggle is about. And in that sense, I think they're actually behind, if you want to get down to like who is running the show, the emphasis is always on they need to be moderate to win Pennsylvania, Illinois, et cetera. And that's true, but it's the radicals being tactically moderate. It's not the moderates taking over the essence of the party. And if you see the responses to things like, John Brown, even when supposedly they're all, even some of the radicals are having to sort of dial back their anti-slavery. It's such a half-assed set of disclaimers that they offer in terms of their resistance to slavery.
I agree with you, and I think Lincoln is a perfect example of this. Lincoln is a moderate guy, no question. Yeah. But on the other hand, his language against slavery is not that different from the radicals.
But I didn't answer your class conflict question, which is also a tricky one, and something that in some ways can't really be answered adequately in a book just on the 1850s, because I think this is a process that unfolds across the Civil War era. But I mean, I guess you mentioned the Lynn strike. I don't totally I'm not satisfied with Dawley's interpretation of that. The truth is, right, Lincoln went to Lynn and gave a speech supporting the strikers. Not a rabble rousing, kill your boss kind of speech, but a speech that contrasted the right of northern workers to strike, which even Gabor Borit says he actually meant it. That he actually meant not just the right to quit, but the right to actually organize and strike with the condition of labor under slavery, and that in effect Lincoln was making an argument that's not identical to Marx's, labor cannot be emancipated in white skin while it's branded in black skin. He wasn't, but an argument that's congruent with that. And I think a lot of Republican arguments against slavery, in the sense that they do make the kind of classic move of identifying all oppression with slavery, but they also identify specifically slavery as a form of labor exploitation to connect it to labor exploitation in the North. And they're not a party of the working class. The Catholic working class, by and large, stays Democrat. But they are a party of that targets not just the lords of the lash and the lords of the loom, but that targets slavery as a system of capital that is analogous to the domination in some ways of workers in the North. I mean, in the compilation of all the responses to the Mudsill speech is probably the best case on this. This is not a kind of a marginal part of Republican rhetoric, especially in the late 1850s. It becomes pretty central. We are not, greasy mudsills for a Lincoln. That's the title, I think, of McPherson's famous chapter on this. That is a kind of class politics that, it's true, does not lead directly to a revision of class relations in the North, but I don't think I'm not satisfied with an explanation that says it's entirely a distraction from those class relations either. I think what ends up happening in the Civil War and afterwards is a maturation of the structural conditions that favor the employer. But I'm not convinced that in the 1850s this kind of rhetoric was actually the kind of fig leaf or the kind of mystification that derailed a incipient working class revolution in the North. I think, in a sense, it's closer to the case that they worked together. And actually, Sean Griffin, who's here, has written a lot about this, about the relationship between anti-slavery and labor. I think we're revising a lot of those older. Going back to your uncle was actually very good on this. Philip Foner wrote a lot about anti-slavery by the 1850s embracing labor and vice versa.
No, definitely did. I'm going to move over. I'm going to leave time for questions very shortly, but since we said we get to politics as well as history, I have a couple of questions about the relationship of this work to where we are today. I guess the lesson, and you use this term, I was going to use it too, maybe what we are seeing here is trying to find a usable past for the Sanders movement. In that it shows that mainstream politics may be more open to radicalism than is commonly supposed. Obviously, it's 150 years. Nobody is saying, let's go back and start campaigning about mudsills and everything, But
you could try it.
But also one of your political messages, I guess, is that. I don't know, the difference between moral politics and, I don't know what you call it, practical politics.
Material politics.
Yeah, or politics of economic self-interest, let's say, whether it's Homestead Acts or tariffs for industry, there's a modern issue. But that, in other words, the Republicans kind of figured out, according to Matt here, that you don't need to kind of subordinate your moral emphasis in order to emphasize economically relevant issues to people. Now, is that a model for the present, do you think?
Yeah, I'm trying to find this quote in my piece here from Seward, because I do think actually we could borrow some of the rhetoric here. I guess I'm not going to find it. Seward does. He talks about the 1%. He talks about they literally. I think at one point the New York Tribune prints. We talk Bernie Sanders. It's in a anticipation of Labor's 2017 manifesto. The New York Tribune prints the entirety of Shelley's Shelley's poem about rise like lions from your slumber, the many and the few. I think Republicans are, and I think that dimension, people talk about majoritarian impulse against the slave power and the way that they, Leonard Richards and others have written about this, the way the slave power is very small and the northern majority, even the non-slaveholding majority of the country is very large, including in the South. But I don't think we've captured, in a sense, what you could call Republican populism, the way in which they actively don't just sort of recite these statistics, but embrace anti-slavery as a politics of and for the masses, the many against the few. And I think that political formula to sort of tackle, really
But isn't it easier to do that when the few are in a separate society, so to speak, not in their own?
Yes.
That's the problem. But I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, it is easier. It is easier in that sense, but not entirely. I mean, if you think about the sort of position, how many Americans in Michigan knew a slaveholder? How many Americans in Michigan today know a member of the 1%? I mean, is it really that? I'm not saying it's not different, but I don't know if I don't know if it entails. I think that kind of populist politics obviously can still be successful today, as we've seen in a number of contexts. And I would say, I mean, a couple things. On the question of material and moral, I mean, I think there is a tendency to, in a lot of the historiography, to identify radicalism with moralism, and that is a kind of almost an unstated kind of presupposition about this literature, that if you veer away from both Republicans' celebrators and their critics, sort of presume that if you veer away from a kind of a focus on the immorality of slavery, or the kind of cruelty of slavery, or the kind of brutality of slavery to the slave, and if you in any way attempt to fuse that to a material critique of the ways in which the slave power suppresses your wages, blocks your access to land, prevents your harbor or your railroad from getting built, that is somehow a step toward moderation. And I guess this is where, not so much that I'm doing usable past for Sanders, but that I'm actually using the peculiar quality of historical knowledge, using the present to sort of revise what seems to me a totally untenable set of historical assumptions, that connecting the moral and the material, I mean, this is somebody like Michael Holt has made this argument most emphatically, but a lot of people, that bringing in material politics, whenever Republicans talked about the Homestead Act, that somehow they're distracting the question of slavery, that the only proper way to tackle slavery is to bang on like William Lloyd Garrison about it. When in fact, I think the case is that building a moral and material fusion in which one's interests are connected to one's values is by far a more effective form of mass politics that today and in 1860.
Yeah. Do you think, this is the last question, and then we'll, until we go to questions from everyone else, I've kind of been feeling that these radical Republicans might actually be a good model for politics in the present, in that they, over their whole career, they kind of understood how to operate both in and out of the system at the same time. And we may not really have, we've lost that a little bit. They were very adamant about not compromising principle, but they also were adamant about compromising politics when necessary. Thaddeus Stevens was always taking half a loaf when that was all that was available, but without losing sight of his fundamental long-term aims. I don't agree with you that the radicals, this may have been a sort of a slip of the tongue with a majority of the Republican Party. I think they were, elsewhere you call them the vanguard, which I think is a better way of looking at them. They are putting forward a clear ideology, which it may not be the majority of the party, but at least they have it. They have a direction, and in a crisis situation when a lot of people who don't have a clear sense of what to do are likely to find appealing a group that does, you know?
Right. Oh, just quickly on that.
Yeah,
I don't want to. You have another question?
No, that's it.
The take was a majority of a majority, in the sense that because we're so focused on these lower North states and winning those states in 1860, we forget that the majority of the North actually lived in the Upper North.
Right,
you know that
right,
that
New England and
exactly New England and the Upper Midwest and New York. And if you look at where, and even in the upper tier of the lower North was
Right.
was pretty radical.
Yeah.
You know, of Northern Illinois, the northern
Right.
tier of Pennsylvania, et cetera. So, and if you look at who, and this is where I want to talk about, I actually don't know if I love the vanguard term, because that implies that they're way ahead of the masses. And I think one thing that I'm increasingly convinced of is that they're responding to the masses. In 1856, the most popular Republican speaker, all of the hard-bitten Thaddeus Stevens, yes, absolutely. Thaddeus Stevens wanted to nominate, what was his name? The governor, the Supreme Court justice.
McLean?
McLean in
Yeah.
1856, because he thought he could carry, he
Ohio,
was
yeah.
completely cynical about candidates. He would,
Right.
Who's
Who's electable?
Exactly,
Right?
who's electable, right? But increasingly in the 56 campaign, even the electability cynics see that the most popular speakers on the campaign trail are the Sewards. The most popular campaign literature in 56 is Sumner's Crime Against Kansas, which is a red-hot abolitionist speech. Anson Burlingame, who challenged the guy who beat up Sumner in the Senate,
right.
Preston Brooks, and was kind of this macho radical. He was the rock star of the 1856 campaign in Pennsylvania, in Indiana. And in 1862, when Seward gives his grand tour of the upper Midwest, these speeches, he's not giving milquetoast speeches about how we need to sort of all come together and rebuild America or something like that. He's targeting the slave power as the enemy of democracy and as the enemy of freedom and the kind of the.
But the danger here, and
Yeah.
then we will stop, is that when you have a coalition like that, you talked about how the struggle against slavery in the war doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes from a long history. Yeah. But, Du Bois, as you quote, later says, in the 1870s, property, as he calls it, reasserts control. Yeah. And there are roots of that also,
Yes.
right? So that's the danger of this kind of coalitional politics, that your ally may suddenly become the guy who's in charge, right?
Inescapable danger. It's a struggle. It's contested. Yeah. This is the story of American freedom, as somebody once termed it. There's no escaping this struggle. Right. But I guess the point is that I think this moment has been kind of left in the cupboard as a moment when not just a few moralists, but the majority of it. And by the way, I've slighted this, but I hope I don't slight it in the book. Women were hugely involved in this campaign. When you're talking about the rallies, women weren't voting, but if you talk about the rallies of 25,000 people, something, maybe not half, but a huge chunk of them were women. Lydia Marie Child. Okay, she's a radical, but she's like, I've never been more interested in. She's a vaguely Garrisonian abolitionist. I've never been more interested in a campaign than in 1856. Women are absolutely part of this. The rank and file of the North is engaged. C.L.R. James had a line, I think I tweeted today, I just want to read it today, about it's. He says that the capitalist class knows that it has won its own freedom by a revolution. The modern industrial and financial magnates know that the Civil War was in reality the Second American Revolution, whereby the power of the slaveholders was broken once and for all. But the capitalists, having gained their power by revolution, now spare no pains in denouncing the revolution and turning the minds of the workers from any radical solution to the problems. One way of doing this is to suppress the role played by the masses of American people in the great revolutions. This is. I think that historians have too often been the accomplices of the capitalists here in kind of denying the radical potential of the American masses. No, not intentionally, but I think functionally. So I think we need to resist that.
All right. Well, listen, on that note, let's thank Matt for presenting all this. And